Hi, I'm Emma. The last time I saw my father smile at me was the day before I told him I was switching to the night shift rotation. My mother stopped calling me her sunshine girl when I chose to work under fluorescent lights instead of daylight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They said I was throwing my life away for a paycheck. That? I'd never find love in the shadows of midnight rounds. That I was betraying our family legacy of success. But what they never expected was that those same night shifts they despised would one day save their lives. And when they walked into that hospital wing, the plaque bearing my name made them realize just how wrong they'd been all along. Growing up in Lakeside, Michigan as Emma Chen meant living in the carefully constructed world my parents had built. Our two-story colonial in Maple Ridge was the backdrop to their American dream, the successful immigrant story they loved to tell at every community gathering, the pristine lawn my father mowed each Saturday morning, the gleaming kitchen counters where my mother prepared traditional dishes for the doctors and lawyers they invited for dinner, the polished piano where I practiced Bach and Mozart for hours while my parents nodded approvingly from the doorway. A Chen succeeds in the daylight, my father would say, his voice firm as bedrock. We don't hide our achievements. My mother would add, good families stay together. Good daughters follow the path. I believed them. I played my part. Straight A's through high school. Pre-med at the University of Michigan. The perfect application to medical school that my father reviewed 3 times before I submitted it. I was the daughter they wanted. Visible, accomplished, obedient. Until my 3rd year of residency, when everything changed. It started with a simple assignment. 2 weeks of night shifts in the emergency department at Lakeside Memorial. I dreaded it at first, worried about the disruption to my sleep schedule, the isolation, the darkness. I didn't tell my parents about the temporary rotation. It seemed unnecessary to worry them over something so brief. But then something unexpected happened. I loved it. The ER at night had a different rhythm, more urgent, more real. The patients who came through those sliding doors at 3 a.m. weren't there for routine checkups or minor complaints. They needed us. The skeleton crew of night staff moved with practiced efficiency. No bureaucracy, no hospital politics, just medicine in its purest form. You've got good instincts for this, Dr. James Peterson told me after we stabilized a car accident victim. He was the attending physician who'd been working nights for 15 years. His hair was prematurely gray, but his eyes were sharp and kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. Most residents count the minutes until their night rotation ends. I shrugged, trying to seem casual. It's different. I like different. The truth was more complicated. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions without hearing my parents' voices in my head, without considering how each choice would look on my resume or to our family, friends. In the quiet hours between emergencies, I found myself thinking my own thoughts, dreaming my own dreams. When the 2 weeks ended, I requested to extend my night rotation. My program director raised an eyebrow but approved it. My fellow residents whispered about it in the break room. But none of that bothered me nearly as much as telling my parents. I chose a Sunday dinner at their house, neutral territory but still within the boundaries of family tradition. My brother Michael was there too, with his wife and their new baby. Perfect Michael, with his downtown private practice open 9 to 5, his house 3 blocks from our parents, his life unfolding exactly according to plan. The dining room smelled like star anise and soy sauce. Steam rose from the hot pot in the center of the table. My mother had made all my favorites, including the red bean dessert that took hours to prepare. I should have recognized the warning sign. She always cooked most elaborately when she was anxious. I've been meaning to tell you, I said during a lull in the conversation. I've switched to the night shift rotation. Permanently. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's chopsticks froze halfway to his mouth. My mother's smile stiffened like cooling wax. "That's temporary," my father said finally. "For training purposes." "No, it's my choice. I requested it." "Why would you do that?" my mother asked, her voice higher than usual. "You won't be able to attend any of the hospital fundraisers. You'll miss all the networking opportunities." I took a deep breath. "Because I'm a better doctor at night. The work feels more meaningful." My father set down his chopsticks with deliberate care. "Meaningful work doesn't happen in the dark, Emma. Successful people, respected people, don't hide away when everyone else is sleeping." "I'm not hiding," I said, feeling the first flicker of anger. "I'm serving patients who need emergency care." "What about starting your own practice?" my mother interjected. "Like Michael, you can't build a private practice working nights." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife suddenly became very interested in feeding the baby. "I don't want a private practice," I said quietly. "I want to work in emergency medicine." My father's face changed then. The disappointment I was familiar with hardened into something colder, more final. "Do you understand what we sacrificed for you to become a doctor? We didn't come to this country for you to throw everything away." "I'm not throwing anything away," I insisted. "I'm still a doctor. I still help people." "You're choosing to be invisible," my mother said, tears forming in her eyes. "You're choosing to turn your back on everything we built for you." I looked around the table, at my father's rigid posture, my mother's trembling hands, Michael's averted gaze. These people who claimed to love me couldn't see me at all. They saw only the reflection of their own expectations. "This is my life," I said. "My career. My choice." My father stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Then make your choice." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, but understand what it means. What it meant became clear over the following weeks. My mother's daily calls dwindled to weekly, then monthly. My father stopped picking up the phone altogether. Invitations to family gatherings arrived for Michael, and family only. When I showed up anyway, conversations halted when I entered rooms. My mother hugged me with stiff arms. My father spoke to me in monosyllables. The final break came 6 months later, at Lunar New Year. Always the most important celebration in our house. I'd arranged to swap shifts so I could attend the family dinner. I brought a gift for my parents, a delicate jade plant I'd carefully tended for months. I rang the doorbell 3 times before Michael answered, his expression uncomfortable. "Hey," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Did Mom call you?" "About what?" He hesitated. "They decided to keep it small this year. Just immediate family." Behind him, I could see the dining room table set for at least 12 people. Red envelopes were stacked by the entrance. The house smelled like dumplings and sweet rice cakes. "I am immediate family," I said, my voice sounding strange in my ears. "Emma, don't make this harder," Michael pleaded. "They're upset. Give them time." "Time for what? To forgive me for doing my job?" He sighed. "For choosing a path they don't understand. You know how they are about appearances. About success." "I'm successful," I said, the jade plant heavy in my hands. "I save lives almost every night." "But nobody sees it," he said, finally revealing the heart of the problem. "Nobody important anyway." I stood there on the porch, snow gathering. On my shoulders, understanding at last that the problem had never been the night shift itself. It was what the night shift represented, a version of success that couldn't be displayed, couldn't be bragged about, couldn't be used to elevate our family's status. A kind of work that happened in shadow, not spotlight. "Here," I said, handing him the plant. "Give this to Mom and Dad. Tell them I stopped by." He took it reluctantly. Emma, they'll come around eventually. I didn't answer. I just walked back to my car through the falling snow, the cold seeping through my coat. As I drove away, I could see the warm light spilling from the windows of my childhood home, illuminating the gathered figures of relatives and family friends. Everyone who mattered, according to my parents. Everyone except me. That night, at the eye hospital, I threw myself into work with a new intensity. A multi-car pileup on the highway brought in dozens of victims, and we worked frantically to stabilize the most critical cases. Around 3 a.m. during a brief lull, I found myself in the break room, staring blankly at a vending machine. "Rough night?" Dr. Peterson asked, appearing beside me with 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee. I accepted one gratefully. Not the medicine part, the other part. He nodded. After nearly a year of working together, he knew enough about my family situation. "Want to talk about it?" I shook my head, then changed my mind. They threw a New Year celebration without me. My brother said I'm not immediate family anymore. "Ah," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. The "you're dead to us until you conform" approach. Classic. Despite everything, I laughed. James had a way of cutting through pretense. It was why he was such a good emergency doctor, and why administration always kept him on the night shift, away from sensitive donors and hospital politics. "You know what I've learned after 15 years?" he said, leaning against the wall. "There are 2 kinds of medicine. The kind people do to be seen doing it, and the kind people do because someone needs to do it." I thought about that distinction often in the years that followed. As the silence from my family hardened into estrangement, I built a different kind of life. I formed bonds with the night shift crew, the nurses who knew which veins would take an IV on the first try, the techs who could calm agitated patients with a few quiet words, the paramedics who delivered patients with succinct, life-saving information. We became a kind of family, united by the strange, altered reality of working while the rest of the world slept. We celebrated birthdays with candles stuck in cafeteria muffins. We covered each other's shifts when someone's kid got sick or when a relationship ended. We held each other up on the hardest nights, when we lost patience despite everything we tried. Dr. Peterson, James, became my mentor and eventually my closest friend. He pushed me to take the lead on difficult cases, to publish research on emergency protocols, to present at conferences even though it meant adjusting my sleep schedule. "Your work matters," he'd say. "Make sure the right people know it." 3. Years after the Lunar New Year incident, I was appointed Director of Emergency Medicine for the night shift. 5 years in, I developed a new protocol for stroke interventions that reduced mortality by nearly 20%. 7 years in, I was invited to join the hospital's leadership committee, the first night shift doctor to hold the position. I sent announcements of each achievement to my parents' address. The envelopes never came back, but I never received a response either. Sometimes I'd run into my brother at medical conferences, and we'd exchange stiff pleasantries. He'd mention that our parents were fine, that they asked about me sometimes. I pretended to believe him. "You could just call them," James suggested once, after finding me staring at my phone on my parents' anniversary. "They made their choice," I said, echoing my father's words from years before. "They chose appearances over me." But the truth was more complicated. I was afraid. Afraid they would reject me again. Afraid they still wouldn't see the value in the path I'd chosen. Afraid that some part of me still craved their approval, despite everything. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in March, nearly a decade after I'd been cut out of my family. I was reviewing charts when my pager went off. Multiple trauma patients incoming from a restaurant fire downtown. 2 critical, 4 serious, multiple minor injuries. We prepared the trauma bays, called in additional staff, and waited for the ambulances. The first patient arrived with severe burns and smoke inhalation. The paramedics were performing CPR as they wheeled the gurney through the doors. "Male, mid-60s, found unconscious near the kitchen exit, the paramedic reported. Pulse was thready on scene, lost it en route. I moved to the head of the gurney, ready to intubate. As the nurses cut away the man's charred clothing, I glanced down at his face, blackened with soot and distorted from swelling. Something about the shape of his jaw, the angle of his cheekbones. "Emma," the charge nurse said, her voice strange. "The patient's ID. I think—" I looked at the partially melted driver's license in her hand. Robert Chen. My father's name. My father's date of birth. The world narrowed to a single point. I stared at the unconscious man on the gurney. This stranger who shared my blood, whose approval I'd craved for so long, who now lay helpless before me. For one terrible moment, I couldn't move. Then training took over. "Continue compressions," I ordered, my voice steadier than it had any right to be. "Get the crash cart. We need to intubate now." The next minutes blurred into medical protocols I could perform in my sleep. Secure the airway, start IV fluids, push medications, check for other injuries. My hands moved with practiced precision while my mind screamed. The second critical patient arrived. Female, same age range, similar injuries. Even before I saw her face or checked her ID, I knew. My mother. I forced myself to focus on the medicine, not the faces. These were patients who needed my skills. The skills I'd honed working nights for a decade, away from my family's judgment and disappointment. The skills they'd dismissed as invisible, unimportant. Hours passed in a desperate struggle to stabilize them both. My father's heart stopped twice, more. My mother's blood pressure kept dropping. The burn trauma team arrived from the main hospital campus. I gave report in a voice that belonged to someone else, a doctor with no personal connection to these particular patients. As dawn broke, I found myself in the surgical waiting room. Both my parents had been transferred to the burn unit for specialized care. Both were alive, but barely. Their prognosis was uncertain. James found me there, still in my scrubs, staring at nothing. He sat beside me without speaking, his solid presence more comforting than any words could be. "I kept thinking they would recognize me," I said finally. "Even through the oxygen mask, even with all the chaos. I kept thinking one of them would open their eyes and know me." "They were unconscious, Emma." "Before that, at the restaurant. They were celebrating their anniversary at Silver Palace. I used to go there with them every year." I laughed hollowly. "I sent them a card last week. They probably threw it away." James placed his hand over mine. "You saved their lives tonight." "Any doctor would have done the same." "But it wasn't any doctor. It was you, the daughter they rejected because she chose to work nights." I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "They might still die." "They might," he agreed, "but they have a chance because of you. Because you were here, in this hospital, on this shift." My parents survived the initial crisis, but their recovery would be long and difficult. As they stabilized, I faced a decision: remain their doctor or recuse myself due to personal connection. Standard protocol said I should step back, let others take over their care. I chose to stay, not as their primary physician, but as part of the team. I reviewed their charts each night. I checked with the day staff about their progress. I made sure they received the best possible care, even though they remained unconscious, unaware of my involvement. 2 weeks after the fire, my mother woke up. Another week later, my father followed. Neither was told immediately who had treated them in those critical first hours. The burn unit staff knew only that I was monitoring their cases with special interest. A month into their hospitalization, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Diana Reynolds, the hospital's chief administrator. I'd worked with her on several committees, but never on anything that warranted a personal call at 7 a.m., just as my shift was ending. "Emma," she said when I answered. I need to see you in my office this morning. It's important. I changed out of my scrubs, splashed water on my face, and headed to the administration wing. Diana's office was on the top floor, with windows overlooking the lake. She greeted me with unusual formality. "I've been reviewing the grant proposals for the new emergency wing," she said, indicating a stack of folders on her desk. "Your submission was particularly impressive." I nodded cautiously. The new wing had been in planning for years, a state-of-the-art emergency department that would replace our aging facilities. I'd submitted a proposal for its operational structure months ago, never expecting it to receive serious consideration. "The board met yesterday," Diana continued. "We've selected your proposal for implementation. Additionally, we'd like you to serve as the inaugural director of the new facility." I sat very still, processing her words. "That's unexpected." "Is it?" She smiled slightly. "Your night shift protocols have reduced mortality rates across the board. Your research is being implemented in hospitals nationwide, and that's not even mentioning your work during the Chen case." My head snapped up. "The Chen case?" "Your parents," Diana said gently. "Yes, Emma, we know. The entire hospital knows. You saved their lives without them even knowing who you were. That kind of professionalism, that commitment to patient care regardless of personal history, that's exactly what we want leading our new facility." I didn't know what to say. After years of feeling invisible, of doing work that happened in darkness, of being rejected by my family for choosing this path, suddenly the value of that work was being recognized in the most public way possible. "There's one more thing," Diana added. "The Lewis Foundation has offered a substantial endowment for the wing. They've requested naming rights." I nodded, unsurprised. The Lewis family were major donors to the hospital. "They want to name it after you." I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "After me?" "The Emma Chen Emergency Center," Diana confirmed. "James Peterson is on the Lewis Foundation board. He made quite a compelling case." Of course, James, my mentor, my friend, who had seen me clearly from the beginning. "Your parents are being discharged next week," Diana said, changing the subject. "With practiced ease. Their recovery will continue on an outpatient basis. They've been asking questions about their emergency treatment, specifically about the doctor who treated them on arrival." I swallowed hard. "What have you told them?" "Nothing yet. That's your story to tell, not mine." She paused. "The naming ceremony for the new wing is scheduled for next month. Consider your options, Emma." I walked out of Diana's office in a daze, her words echoing in my head. My name on the building. Recognition for work done in darkness. A chance to show my parents what I had built while they weren't watching. But what did I want from that moment? Vindication? Revenge? Or something else entirely? The answer came to me slowly over the following days, as I continued my night shifts, as I checked my parents' charts from a distance, as I watched the construction crews breaking ground for the new wing. I wanted to be seen, not just by my parents, but by myself. I wanted to own the path I had chosen, the good I had done, the lives I had saved, including theirs. The naming ceremony was scheduled for a bright Tuesday morning in May. I requested the night off, the first time I'd missed a Tuesday shift in years. I wore a simple blue dress, my hair pulled back, nothing flashy. No need to compete with the gleaming letters of my name that would soon adorn the hospital entrance. The hospital lobby was filled with board members, donors, reporters, staff. James stood near the front, looking uncharacteristically formal in a tie. Diana presided over the gathering with practiced charm. I spotted Michael in the crowd, his expression a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite name. And there, in wheelchairs near the side entrance, were my parents. Thinner than I remembered. My father's hands bandaged, my mother's face still marked with healing burns, both watching the proceedings with confusion. Diana gave a brief speech about innovation and excellence in emergency medicine. James spoke about the impact of night shift protocols on patient outcomes. Then Diana called me to the podium. I hadn't prepared anything formal. As I looked out at the assembled crowd, at the staff who had worked alongside me for years, at my brother who had always straddled the line between my world and our parents, at the two people who had given me life and then rejected the life I chose, I knew exactly what needed to be said. 10 years ago, I chose to work the night shift. I began. I chose a kind of medicine that happens in darkness, when most of the world is asleep. It wasn't the path everyone understood or valued, but it was the right path for me. I saw my father shift in his wheelchair, his eyes narrowing as he recognized my voice. Emergency medicine at night is about seeing people at their most vulnerable, their most afraid. It's about being present in the worst moments of their lives. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who comes through those doors, regardless of who they are or what brought them there. My mother's hand went to her throat, where her burns were still healing. A month ago, 2 patients came into our emergency department, critical from a restaurant fire. They didn't know who was treating them. They couldn't see the face behind the mask, the hands behind the gloves. But I saw them. I knew them. They were my parents. A murmur went through the crowd. My parents' expressions shifted from confusion to shock to something unreadable. I hadn't spoken to them in a decade. But in that moment, they weren't the people who had rejected me for my choices. They were simply patients who needed care. The care I had spent 10 years learning to provide on the night shift they had dismissed as worthless. I paused, gathering myself. This new emergency center isn't about me. It's about every patient who needs help when the world is dark. It's about every healthcare worker who chooses to be present during those hours. And it's about recognizing that some of the most important work happens outside the spotlight, in moments no one else sees. As I stepped away from the podium, as the ceremonial ribbon was cut, as cameras flashed and applause rose, I made my way slowly through the crowd toward my parents. They watched me approach, these strangers who had once been my whole world. My father spoke first, his voice raspy from the ventilator that had kept him breathing. "You saved us." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "And now they're naming this place after you," my mother added, her eyes taking in the banner, the building plans, the gathering of hospital leadership. "Yes," I said simply. My father looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a decade. "We didn't understand," he said finally. "We thought you were hiding." "I wasn't hiding," I replied. "I was exactly where I needed to be." My mother reached for my hand, her skin papery and warm. When they told us who treated us that night, who kept us alive until help came, I couldn't believe it. After everything we said, everything we did. I thought about the years of silence, the missed celebrations, the achievements unacknowledged, the jade plant I'd given Michael on that snowy porch, the cards returned unopened, the family I'd built among the night shift crew while my blood relatives carried on without me. "You once told me that a Chen succeeds in the daylight," I said, to my father. "But I found my purpose in the darkness. And now, that purpose has brought us back into the light. All of us." He nodded slowly, tears gathering in his eyes. My mother squeezed my hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't a happy ending tied with a neat bow. It was something more complex, more real, a beginning rather than an end. A recognition that some journeys must happen in darkness before they can be understood in the light. As the ceremony concluded, as my name was officially unveiled on the building where I had found my calling, I stood between my parents' wheelchairs, one hand on each, not as their obedient daughter, not as the doctor who had saved them, but as myself, Emma Chen, night shift physician, emergency director, a woman who had found her own path and walked it without apology. The sunlight caught the letters of my name on the glass entrance. My mother followed my gaze and whispered, "It's beautiful, Emma." For the first time in years, I felt something like peace settle over me. Not because they finally approved, but because their approval no longer defined my worth. "Yes," I agreed, looking at the building where lives would be saved in darkness for years to come. "Yes, it is." A year after the naming ceremony, I found myself standing in the kitchen of my apartment, preparing a meal I hadn't cooked in decades. The fragrance of star anise and soy sauce filled the space, reminding me of Sunday dinners from another lifetime. My hands moved with muscle memory as I shaped the dumplings, pleating the edges just as my mother had taught me, the filling a careful blend of pork, chives, and ginger. The doorbell rang just as I placed the last dumpling on the tray. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, took a deep breath, and went to answer it. My parents stood in the hallway, looking smaller than I remembered from my childhood, but more substantial than they had in their wheelchairs at the hospital. My father carried a small potted plant, not jade, but a miniature orange tree, its branches heavy with tiny fruit. My mother held a red envelope, the traditional symbol of blessings and new beginnings. "We brought these," my father said, his voice still raspy from the fire damage. "For your home." I stepped aside to let them enter, noticing how my mother's eyes darted around the apartment, taking in the details of my life they had missed. The framed research articles on the wall, the collection of coffee mugs from medical conferences, the photographs of me with the night shift crew at various celebrations. "It smells like home," my mother said, moving toward the kitchen. She peered at the tray of dumplings and smiled slightly. "You remembered." "Some things you don't forget," I replied. The conversation over dinner was careful, measured. We spoke of neutral topics, the weather, my brother's children, the recovery progress of other fire victims. We avoided the decade of silence, the hurtful words, the ceremonies and achievements they had missed. Yet their presence in my home, eating food I had prepared, represented a kind of truce neither of us had believed possible a year ago. As I cleared the dishes, my father cleared his throat. "We have been thinking," he said, exchanging glances, with my mother, "about what you said at the ceremony, about being where you needed to be." I waited, hands stilling on the plates. "We were wrong," he continued, each word clearly difficult, "to judge your path when we couldn't see where it led." It wasn't quite an apology, but from my father, a man who had built his identity on being right, on knowing the best way forward, it was monumental. "We would like to see," my mother added, "your work, the night shift, if that would be permitted." I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. "You want to observe an emergency room night shift?" They nodded in unison, their expressions a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "It's not glamorous," I warned them. "Not like the ceremony. It's chaotic, sometimes frightening, often boring in between emergencies. We want to understand," my father said simply. So it was arranged. The following week, my parents received visitor badges and permission to observe from the newly constructed staff area of the Emma Chen Emergency Center. James raised an eyebrow when I told him of the plan, but supported it fully. "They need to see you in your element," he said, with the insight that had guided me for years. Not just the result, but the work itself. The night they came, I felt an odd nervousness I hadn't experienced since my earliest days of residency. I found myself hyper-aware of everything: the controlled chaos of the department, the brusque efficiency of the staff, the unpredictable nature of the cases that arrived through our doors. My parents arrived at 11, dressed formally as if for church. I met them in the lobby, already in my scrubs with my stethoscope around my neck. "These are the quiet hours," I explained as I guided them to the observation area. Between the Mai Dai bar fights and the early morning cardiac events, it might pick up around 2. They nodded solemnly, settling into the chairs I'd arranged for them. From there, they could see most of the department without being in the way. The nurses' station, the triage area, the trauma bays. "You'll stay here," I instructed. "If we get busy, someone will show you to the conference room where you can wait." For the first hour, they watched in silence as I conducted rounds, checked charts, and consulted with nurses about the handful of patients currently under our care. I explained cases in hushed tones when I could: the elderly man with pneumonia, the college student with alcohol poisoning, the young woman having an asthma attack. My pager went off just after midnight. Multiple vehicle accident on the highway, 4 patients inbound, 2 critical. The department snapped into alert mode, staff moving with practiced precision to prepare for the incoming trauma. I glanced at my parents, saw the concern on their faces, and signaled to a volunteer to escort them to the waiting area. "No," my father said firmly. "We will stay, if you permit it." I hesitated, then nodded. "Stay back. Don't interfere. This is why I'm here." The next hours blurred into controlled emergency, the ambulances arriving in quick succession, the critical triage decisions, the life-saving interventions performed under pressure, a teenager with a head injury who seized on arrival, a middle-aged woman with a pneumothorax that required immediate chest tube placement, an elderly man with multiple fractures but stable vitals, a young driver, barely conscious, bleeding internally. I moved between cases, directing staff, performing procedures, calling for specialist consults, making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. I was vaguely aware of my parents watching, their faces pale in the harsh fluorescent lighting, but I couldn't spare attention for their reactions. By 3 a.m, all patients were stabilized. The teenager was on his way to surgery. The woman with the pneumothorax was breathing easier. The elderly man was resting comfortably with pain control, and the young driver was in the ICU, critical, but alive. I found my parents still in the observation area, my mother clutching my father's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. They looked shell-shocked, but also something else. Something I couldn't quite read. "That's what a bad night looks like," I said, suddenly exhausted. 4 trauma patients at once is challenging even with full staffing. "You knew exactly what to do," my father said quietly. "Everyone looked to you." I shrugged. "It's my job. We train for this." "The boy," my mother said. "The one with the head injury. He reminded me of Michael when he fell from the treehouse. Remember? You were 12. You ran for the first aid kit while your father called the ambulance." I did remember, that day when Michael's mistake had become a family story told at gatherings, while my quick thinking went unmentioned. I had forgotten I'd been the one to get the first aid kit, to apply pressure to the wound while we waited for help. "You were always meant for this," my father said, his voice rougher than usual. Even then, the simple acknowledgement that perhaps my path had been visible all along, if only they had known how to look, broke something open inside me. Not healing, not yet, but a crack in the wall I'd built between us. "There's more to see," I said, gesturing to the department around us. "We have 4 more hours before shift change." The remainder of the night was quieter: a pregnant woman with early contractions, an insomniac elderly patient who really just needed company, a young man with unexplained chest pain that turned out to be anxiety rather than cardiac. Through it all, my parents watched as I moved through the spaces between emergency and routine care, between medical intervention and human connection. Near the end of my shift, as dawn light began to filter through the high windows of the department, a final ambulance arrived. The paramedics wheeled in a woman in her 70s, approximately my mother's age, struggling to breathe. "Mrs. Rodriguez, 76, found by her son having difficulty breathing." the paramedic reported. History of COPD, not responding to her home. Nebulizer treatments. Oxygen saturation 82% on room air, up to 89% on supplemental oxygen. I moved to her side, taking her hand. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm Dr. Chen. We're going to help you breathe easier, okay? She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, her chest heaving with the effort of drawing breath. I ordered treatments, adjusted her oxygen, and spoke to her in a calm, reassuring voice throughout. When her breathing finally eased and her oxygen levels stabilized, the relief in her eyes was immediate and profound. "Thank you, doctor," she whispered, clutching my hand. "I thought I was dying." "Not today," I assured her. "Not on my watch." As I stepped away from her bed, I caught my mother wiping a tear from her cheek. My father stood straighter, his expression solemn but his eyes never leaving my face. By 7, my shift was ending. The day staff arrived, bright and fresh in clean scrubs. I gave report, handed off patients, and finally removed my stethoscope from around my neck. My parents waited by the staff exit, looking exhausted, but somehow lightened. "You must be tired," I said as I approached them. "I can call you a taxi." "We'll wait," my father replied. "If you'd join us for breakfast, to talk about what we saw." The diner across from the hospital was a regular haunt for night shift workers. The waitress knew me by name, brought my usual coffee without asking. My parents ordered tea, looking somewhat out of place among the scrub-clad hospital staff enjoying end-of-shift meals. "So," I said after we had ordered, "that's my night shift." My mother reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture so unexpected I almost pulled away. "Emma," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "what we saw tonight, we had no idea." "That's the point," I replied. "Most people don't. The work happens whether anyone sees it or not." "Those people," my father said slowly. "They look at you the way we wanted important people to look at you, with respect, with trust." I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. The trauma team, the nurses, the paramedics, the patients, they all looked to me with a kind of confidence I had earned through years of night shifts, of being present in the worst moments of strangers' lives. "It's not the recognition we imagined. For you," my mother admitted. "Not the kind of success we thought mattered. But watching you tonight, it was beautiful, Emma. You were beautiful." Her words, so simple and unexpected, broke through the last of my defenses. For years, I had told myself I no longer needed their approval, their understanding. I had built a life, a career, an identity separate from their expectations. But hearing my mother call my work beautiful, the work that had driven us apart for a decade, filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was still empty. "There's something we need to tell you," my father said, his hands wrapped around his teacup. "Something we should have told you sooner." I waited, suddenly tense. "After the fire, after we learned it was you who treated us that night, we went to see Dr. Peterson." This was news to me. James had never mentioned meeting with my parents. "We wanted to understand why the night shift mattered so much to you," my mother explained. "Why you would choose it over everything else." "He showed us your research," my father continued. "Your publications, the data on lives saved because of your protocols. He told us about the residents you've trained, the changes you've implemented across emergency departments statewide." I made a mental note to either thank James or throttle him, depending on how this conversation ended. But most importantly, my mother said, "He showed us the letters." "Letters?" I echoed, confused. "From patients, from families, people you helped in the middle of the night when no one else was watching. He's been collecting them for years, apparently. Hundreds of them." I was stunned. James had never mentioned any letters. He must have reached out to former patients, to families, collecting their stories without my knowledge. "There was one," my father said, his voice dropping to barely above, a whisper. From a man whose wife you helped during a difficult miscarriage. He wrote that you sat with her for an hour after your shift ended, just holding her hand while she cried, that you gave her your personal number in case she needed to talk. I remembered that night. That woman. Her name was Claire. We still exchanged text messages on the anniversary of her loss. And another, my mother added, from parents whose teenage son overdosed. You not only saved his life, but you connected them with treatment resources and support groups. They said their family would have fallen apart without your intervention. The Rodriguez family, their son was 2 years sober now. He volunteered at a recovery center on weekends. James said you never talk about these things, my father said. That you just do them, then move on to the next patient, the next crisis. He said that's why he nominated you for the wing naming, not because of the research or the protocols, though those are important, but because of the humanity you bring to medicine when no one is watching. I swallowed hard, fighting unexpected emotion. That's just the job. No, my mother said firmly. It's not just the job. It's who you are, Emma, who you've always been. We just couldn't see it. My father reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age and slightly crumpled at the corners. He placed it on the table between us. When you were 16, he said, you wrote an essay for a scholarship competition. Do you remember? I shook my head. There had been so many essays, so many applications. It was about why you wanted to become a doctor, my mother explained. You wrote about sitting with Mrs. Lynn from next door after her stroke, reading to her when everyone else was too busy. You wrote that the most important moments in medicine happen when no one is watching, when there's no audience to impress, just one person helping another through darkness. I had no memory of writing those words, but they sounded like something my teenage self might have believed before years of parental expectations had redirected my focus toward more visible achievements. We saved it, my father said, pushing the envelope toward me. We were proud of it. But somewhere along the way, we forgot what it meant. We forgot who you really were. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't need to. The knowledge that they had kept this piece of my younger self, even as they rejected the adult I had become, was enough. We can't undo the past 10 years, my mother said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. We can't give you back the family dinners, the celebrations, the support you deserved. But we can tell you that we see you now, Emma. We see your work, and we are so very proud. The words I had once longed to hear now landed differently than I had imagined. Not as validation I desperately needed, but as recognition of a truth I had already embraced, that my work mattered, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. That the path I had chosen had always been the right one for me, even when it led through darkness and estrangement. I don't know if we can be what we were, I said honestly. Too much has happened. We don't expect that, my father replied. We just hope. Perhaps we can be something new, something better. I looked at these two people across the table, no longer the towering figures of my childhood, but aging, vulnerable humans who had nearly lost their lives in a fire, who had been saved by the daughter they had rejected, who were now trying, imperfectly but sincerely, to build a bridge across the chasm between us. I have next weekend off, I said finally. Maybe you could come for dinner again. I could make something besides dumplings. My mother smiled through her tears. We'd like that very much. Outside the diner, as morning traffic built, and hospital. Shift changes continued. My father did something he hadn't done since I was a child. He hugged me, awkwardly, tentatively, but with genuine emotion. Your grandmother would have been so proud, he whispered. She always said true strength is invisible. I didn't understand what she meant until now. I walked back to my apartment. In the brightening day, mentally and emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. The decade of estrangement hadn't been erased, nor had the hurt it caused. But something had shifted, some barrier had dissolved, allowing for the possibility of a different kind of relationship, one based not on expectations and appearances, but on seeing and being seen for who we truly are. That night, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, I found myself driving back to the hospital. The Emma Chen Emergency Center glowed in the darkness, its lights a beacon for those in need. I parked across the street and just watched for a while as ambulances came and went, as staff moved efficiently behind glass doors, as the work I had championed continued without me. My phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Heard your parents visited. How did it go?" I typed back, "You could have told me about the letters." His response came quickly. "You wouldn't have believed how many lives you've touched. You needed to hear it from them, not me." I smiled, grateful once again for his insight. "Thank you," I wrote, "for everything." 3 dots appeared then. "Just doing what needed to be done, like someone else I know." I put the phone away and continued watching the emergency center, my emergency center, from a distance. Tomorrow night I would be back inside, doing the work I loved in the hours most people feared. But tonight, I allowed myself to see it from the outside, to appreciate the beauty of a place designed to heal, to recognize my own part in creating it. The name on the building wasn't what mattered, I realized. It was what happened inside, in the moments no one saw, in the lives quietly saved, in the comfort offered without expectation of recognition or gratitude. That had always been the heart of my work, the purpose I had found in darkness. My parents might finally understand that now, or they might not completely. But I understood it, and that knowledge would sustain me through whatever came next, whether reconciliation or continued separation, whether public accolades or private satisfaction. I started the car and drove home as dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital in golden light. Whatever the future held, I would face it as I had faced everything else, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose and lived it without apology. 6 months later, I stood in an auditorium filled with medical students from across the region. As the newly appointed director of emergency medicine for the entire Lakeside hospital system, I had been asked to give the keynote address at the white coat ceremony, the ritual that welcomes new students into the medical profession. From the podium, I could see my parents seated in the 3rd row, alongside James and several of my night shift colleagues. My father wore a tie with tiny stethoscopes printed on it, a Father's Day gift I had given him on a whim, never expecting him to actually wear it. My mother had her camera ready, her expression a mixture of pride and anticipation. Our relationship remained a work in progress, Sunday dinners alternating between their house and mine, careful conversations about past hurts, tentative steps toward a new kind of closeness. They had visited the night shift several more times, even bringing homemade meals for the staff on Chinese New Year. My mother had started volunteering at the hospital gift shop. My father had joined a support group for burn survivors and was considering becoming a peer counselor. Small steps, imperfect attempts at bridge building. Not the complete healing of fairy tales, but something real and honest and evolving. I looked out at the sea of fresh faces before me, young people at the beginning of their medical journeys, full of idealism and anxiety and determination. Medicine is not always practiced in the spotlight, I began. Often, it happens in the quietest moments, in the darkest hours, when no one is watching but the patient whose life is in your hands. Those are the moments that will define your career and shape your character as a physician. I spoke about the night shift, about emergency medicine, about finding purpose in unexpected places. I told them about protocols and research, about teamwork and innovation. But most importantly, I told them about the unseen work, the hand-holding, the extra minute of explanation, the follow-up call no one required, but that made all the difference. Some of you will find your calling in surgical theaters, with an audience of colleagues watching your technical brilliance, I said. Others will build practices where patients come to you by appointment in daylight hours for ongoing care. And some of you, perhaps those who don't yet know it, will find yourselves drawn to the in-between spaces, to the emergencies that won't wait for morning, to the patients who need you most when the rest of the world sleeps. I caught my father's eye. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of the path I had chosen, the one he had once dismissed. Whatever specialty you choose, remember this. True healing happens in moments no one celebrates, in conversations no one records, in decisions that will never make headlines. The most important work you do may be invisible to everyone except the lives you touch, and that is enough. That has always been enough. After the ceremony, as students and families mingled in the reception hall, my parents made their way to my side. My father carried a small package wrapped in crimson paper. "You spoke beautifully," my mother said, hugging me without reservation. "Those students are fortunate to learn from you." "We have something for you," my father added, offering the package. "From both of us." I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, intricately carved with cherry blossoms. When I opened it, I found a silver pendant, simple, elegant, with a teardrop pearl in the center. "Grandma Ula's necklace," I whispered, recognizing it immediately. "But I thought it was meant for you," my mother said quietly. "Always. We just forgot that for a while." I lifted the necklace from its velvet lining, feeling its weight in my palm. Not a peace offering, not compensation for years lost, but an acknowledgement of heritage, of belonging, of being seen at last. "Will you help me put it on?" I asked my father. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the clasp at the back of my neck, the silver cool against my skin. When I turned to face them, my mother's eyes filled with tears. "It suits you," she said. "It always would have." James appeared at my elbow, nodding approvingly at the necklace. "Ready for dinner? The night crew is gathering at Lorenzo's to celebrate your new appointment." "We should let you go," my father said, starting to step back. "This is your work. Family's celebration." "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the spontaneity of the offer, "why don't you join us? There's room for everyone at the table." The look that passed between them, surprise, hesitation, then genuine pleasure, told me I had made the right choice. Not erasing boundaries, not pretending the past hadn't happened, but creating space for new possibilities, new configurations of family and belonging. As we walked together toward the restaurant, the pendant resting against my collarbone, I thought about the long, circuitous path that had led us here. The night shifts that had cost me my family and then, improbably, returned them to me. The work in darkness that had ultimately brought light. The invisible healing that had finally become visible, not just in the name on a building, but in the reconciliation none of us had thought possible. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely offers those. It was messy and incomplete, full of scar tissue and tentative new growth. But as we joined my colleagues at the long table in the back of Lorenzo's, as my two worlds collided and began cautiously to merge, I felt a sense of wholeness I hadn't expected to find. "To Dr. Chen," James proposed, raising his glass, "who taught us all that the most important work happens when no one is watching." My parents raised their glasses alongside my colleagues, their expressions solemn but their eyes bright with something that looked finally like understanding. I smiled, touched the pendant at my throat, and lifted my own glass. "To all of us," I replied. "To healing, wherever and whenever it happens. To the work we do in darkness. And to the light that finds us eventually if we stay true to our path." Later that night, as I prepared for my shift, I placed Grandma Ula's pendant carefully in my locker. Not because I was hiding it, but because some treasures aren't meant for the chaos of emergency medicine. They wait, precious and protected, while we do the necessary work of the night. I put on my scrubs, draped my stethoscope around my neck, and stepped into the department that bore my name. Monitors beeped, staff greeted me with familiar nods, and somewhere beyond the automatic doors, an ambulance siren wailed in the distance. Another night shift was beginning, another opportunity to be present in the moments that matter most. Another chance to practice the invisible healing that had always been my true calling, recognized now, finally, by those whose recognition I had once craved above all else. But more importantly, recognized by me, valued by me, chosen by me, again and again with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world and would not be moved from it. I checked my watch, reviewed the board of current patients, and prepared for whatever the night would bring. Emergencies and quiet moments, critical decisions and simple human connections, all unfolding in the hours when most of the world slept. This was where I belonged. This was who I had always been. This was enough. 3 months after my parents observed my night shift, I found myself walking through the half-constructed extension of the Emma Chen Emergency Center. The smell of fresh paint and new drywall filled the air as I stepped carefully around stacked boxes and plastic-wrapped equipment. Construction crews had been working around the clock to complete the pediatric wing, an addition I'd fought for during budget meetings with the hospital board. "What do you think?" James asked, gesturing to the space. He'd joined the hospital, administration full-time now, leaving his clinical duties to focus on expanding emergency services throughout the region. "It's bigger than I expected," I admitted, running my hand along a newly installed counter. "That's because we added the family consultation rooms you wanted," he replied, "the ones with the pull-out beds for parents." I nodded, picturing the space filled with young patients, with worried parents who needed somewhere comfortable to wait during the long night hours. "It's perfect." "There's something else I wanted to show you," James said, leading me toward the back of the wing. He stopped at a door marked Staff Only and pushed it open to reveal a fully equipped break room with comfortable chairs, a small kitchen area, and, most surprisingly, wall-to-wall bookshelves. "What's this?" I asked, stepping inside. "The Emma Chen Memorial Library and Rest Area," he said with a slight smile. "For night shift staff only." I raised an eyebrow at the word memorial. "Should I be concerned you're planning my demise?" "Poor word choice," he admitted. "Let's call it the Emma Chen Sanctuary. A place where your night shift teams can actually decompress between emergencies instead of dozing in those horrible plastic chairs." I walked around the room, noting the thoughtful touches, the blackout curtains, the collection of medical journals, the small refrigerator already stocked with energy drinks and meal prep containers. "This wasn't in the plans." "I approved," I said. "Consider it a gift," James replied, "from the Night Shift Alumni Fund." I gave him a skeptical look. "There's no such thing." "There is now." He handed me an envelope. "Open it later, when you're alone." Before I could question him further, my pager went off, a code in the main ER that required my immediate attention. I tucked the envelope into my pocket and hurried back through the construction zone toward the existing emergency department. The code turned out to be a false alarm, equipment malfunction rather than a patient crisis. But by the time everything was settled, James had left for a budget meeting. I found myself alone in my office during the quiet afternoon lull, the envelope still in my pocket. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of names and numbers. At the top was a simple heading: Night Shift Alumni Contributions. The names included current and former night shift staff, nurses, techs, residents, attendings, along with donation amounts ranging from $50 to several $1,000s. At the bottom of the list was a final tally, $145,000. A note in James's handwriting was paper-clipped to the list. For the people who work in darkness. From the people who understand why it matters. I stared at the paper, throat tight with unexpected emotion. These were people who worked paycheck to paycheck, who had families to support, bills to pay. Yet they had contributed their hard-earned money to create a space that honored the unique challenges of night shift work. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was my mother. "Emma," she said when I answered, her voice tight with what sounded like controlled panic. "Your father collapsed at home this morning. We're in the cardiology wing." I froze. "What happened?" "Chest pain. They're saying possible heart attack. They want to do an angiogram. Can you come?" "I'll be right there," I said, already, grabbing my coat. The cardiology department was 6 floors up and a world away from the emergency center that bore my name. Here, the rhythm was different, measured, scheduled, with none of the chaotic energy of the ER. I found my mother sitting alone in a family waiting area, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. "He was just getting the mail," she said as I sat beside her. Then he clutched his chest and fell to his knees. "I called the ambulance right away." I took her hand, noting how cold her fingers felt. "You did the right thing. Where is he now?" "In procedure, Dr. Whitman is doing the angiogram." She looked at me with frightened eyes. "They said his right coronary artery is blocked. They're going to put in a stent." I nodded, mentally reviewing the procedure, the risks, the recovery process. "Dr. Whitman is excellent. Dad's in good hands." She clutched my fingers tighter. "Will you stay? I know you have your shift tonight, but—" "Of course I'll stay," I assured her. "I'll call in. They can cover for me." We sat in silence for a while, the rhythmic beeping of distant monitors the only sound in the quiet waiting area. I found myself studying my mother's profile, the new lines around her mouth, the slight tremor in her hands that hadn't been there before the fire. She looked older, more vulnerable than the formidable woman who had once decreed the shape of my future. "I'm scared," she whispered eventually. "I can't lose him." The simple admission, so unlike the stoic front she had maintained throughout, my childhood, cracked something open between us. I squeezed her hand. "You won't," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Not today." She leaned against my shoulder slightly, accepting the comfort I offered. "He's been different since that night at the hospital, since watching you work. He talks about you all the time now, to everyone." She gave a weak laugh. "He carries newspaper clippings about the emergency center in his wallet. Shows them to the grocery clerks, the mailman, anyone who will listen." I hadn't known this. In our careful rebuilding of family connections, we'd maintained certain boundaries, spaces where the old hurts still lived, topics we navigated with caution. "The night you let us observe your shift," she continued, "we couldn't sleep afterward. We sat up until dawn talking about everything we'd seen. About you." She looked down at our joined hands. He said, "We've been wrong about so many things. Linda, how many other parents are wrong too?" I wasn't sure how to respond to this revelation, that my father, the man whose approval I'd sought and then learned to live without, had been proud of me when I wasn't looking. "Dr. Chen?" A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Your father is out of procedure. Dr. Whitman would like to speak with you and your mother." We followed her to a consultation room where Dr. Whitman, a cardiologist I knew professionally but not well, waited with a tablet displaying my father's results. "Mrs. Chen, Dr. Chen," he greeted us. "The procedure went well. We placed a stent in the right coronary artery, which was about 90% blocked. There's also some narrowing in the left anterior descending artery, but not enough to require intervention at this time." My mother nodded, clearly trying to absorb the technical information. "So he'll be all right?" "With medication, dietary changes, and cardiac rehabilitation, yes, the prognosis is good." Dr. Whitman turned to me. I've prescribed the standard protocol, but you might want to review it, given your father's specific case. I appreciated the professional courtesy, one doctor to another, but it highlighted the strange dual role I now occupied, both medical expert and frightened daughter. When can we see him? I asked. He's in recovery now. Once he's settled in his room, the nurse will come get you. Dr. Whitman smiled reassuringly. He was asking for both of you as soon as he was alert. My father looked small in the hospital bed, connected to monitors, an IV in his arm. His skin had a grayish tinge, and his eyes were half closed with medication and exhaustion. But when he saw us enter, he attempted to straighten up. "No, Ba," I said, slipping into the Mandarin term of address I hadn't used in years. "Don't try to sit up yet." "Emma," he said, his voice rough. "You came." "Of course I came." I checked his monitors automatically, assessing his vital signs with a professional eye while my personal feelings churned beneath the surface. "Your mother called you?" he asked, glancing between us. My mother nodded, taking his hand. "Of course I called her. She's a doctor, Robert. And she's our daughter." The simple declaration, "She's our daughter," hung in the air between us, weighted with reconciliation. That was still fragile, still forming. "How bad is it?" my father asked me directly, his gaze sharp despite his condition. I considered softening the truth, then decided against it. He deserved my professional assessment as much as my filial concern. The right coronary artery was significantly blocked. They've placed a stent, which should restore normal blood flow. There's some narrowing in another artery that they're going to monitor. It's serious, but treatable. He nodded, accepting this. "And recovery? Medications, cardiac rehab, lifestyle changes." I hesitated, then added, "And you'll need to reduce stress." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Ah, that's the difficult part." "You'll do it," my mother said firmly. "We both will. Whatever changes are necessary." I stayed throughout the evening, helping my mother navigate the hospital system that was my world but foreign territory to her. I explained medication schedules, interpreted medical jargon, and made sure the night nursing staff knew to call me with any concerns. Around midnight, when my father was finally sleeping comfortably, and my mother was dozing in the recliner beside his bed, I stepped out into the hallway to call the emergency department. "How's everything going?" I asked the charge nurse. "Quiet night so far," she replied. "How's your father?" "Stable, recovering." I leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "I'll try to come in for the second half of the shift." "Don't even think about it. We've got everything covered here." Her voice softened. "Take care of your family, Dr. Chen. We'll take care of the patients." Family. The word resonated in a way it hadn't for years. I thanked her and hung up, then stood for a moment in the dimly lit hospital corridor, watching the quiet efficiency of the night shift staff as they moved from room to room. This was the world I had chosen, the world my parents had finally begun to understand and accept. I returned to my father's room and settled into an uncomfortable visitor's chair opposite my mother. Despite the medical crisis that had brought us here, there was something almost peaceful about sitting in the quiet hospital room, the three of us together in a way we hadn't been in a decade. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, light was filtering through the window blinds and a breakfast tray was being delivered. My father was awake, looking marginally better than the night before. "You stayed?" he said when he noticed me stirring. "I stayed," I confirmed, stretching to relieve the stiffness in my neck. My mother had gone to find coffee, leaving us alone, for the first time since his admission. My father adjusted his position slightly, wincing with the movement. "When I was lying on the floor yesterday, waiting for the ambulance," he said quietly, "I thought about the night of the fire. About waking up in the hospital afterward and learning it was you who had treated us. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I nodded for him to continue. I keep thinking about the symmetry, he said. How you were there when we needed you? Most, despite everything we had said and done, and now here you are again. He looked at me with eyes that seemed clearer, more present than they had been in years. I haven't deserved this care, Emma. It's not about deserving, I replied. You're my father. And you're my daughter, but I forgot what that meant. He reached for my hand, his grip weaker than I remembered but determined. I forgot that being your father meant supporting your path, not dictating it. I swallowed hard, unprepared for this conversation so early in the morning, in the vulnerable setting of his hospital room. When we watched you that night, he continued, in the emergency room, moving between those trauma patients, giving orders, making decisions that saved lives, I've never been more proud. Or more ashamed. Let me finish, he said, his voice strengthening. I spent years telling everyone who would listen about Michael's practice, his prestigious address, his important patients. But what you do, what I saw that night, is the real medicine, the medicine that matters when nothing else does. I didn't know what to say. After years of estrangement, after the slow, careful rebuilding of our relationship in recent months, this unequivocal acknowledgement of my choices left me speechless. I told your mother afterwards, he said, that if I ever found myself in a true emergency, I would want a doctor exactly like you. Someone who sees clearly in chaos, someone unafraid of the difficult moments. His eyes held mine. I just never imagined I would actually need that doctor, or that she would still be willing to help me after everything. I will always help you, I said, finding my voice at last. That's never been in question. He nodded, accepting this. I know that now, but I didn't deserve to know it. My mother returned then, carrying 3 cups of coffee and a cardboard. First she took in the scene, our joined hands, the intensity of our expressions, and paused in the doorway. Am I interrupting? No, my father said, releasing my hand. We're just talking about second chances. She set down the coffee tray and took her seat on the other side of the bed. Second chances are good, better than first chances sometimes, because you appreciate them more. The 3 of us sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping mediocre hospital coffee as morning routines continued around us. Vital sign checks, medication administrations, breakfast deliveries. I've been thinking, my father said finally, about what happens after I recover. My mother and I exchanged glances. What do you mean? She asked. I want to volunteer, he said, here at the hospital, in Emma's emergency center. I nearly choked on my coffee. You want to what? Not in a medical capacity, obviously, he clarified, but I could help with translations for Chinese-speaking patients, or just sit with people who are waiting for news about their loved ones. He looked at me uncertainly. If you think that would be useful. I considered his offer, trying to imagine my formal, achievement-oriented father in the chaotic environment of the emergency department. To my surprise, I could see it. His calm demeanor providing reassurance to frightened families, his precise explanations helping bridge communication gaps. Actually, I said slowly, we do need interpreters, especially during night shifts when the regular staff translators aren't available. His face brightened with a kind of purpose I hadn't seen since his retirement. I could do night shifts. I've always been a night owl. My mother laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. Robert Chen, you've complained about staying up past 10 o'clock for 30 years. People can change, he replied with dignity. Emma taught me that. The casual acknowledgement, that I had taught him something valuable rather than the other way around, marked a profound shift in our relationship. No longer was I merely the daughter who had disappointed, then surprised, then finally impressed him. I was someone whose example had changed his perspective, had opened him to new possibilities. "I think it's a wonderful idea," my mother said, patting his arm. "And while you're volunteering, I can finally take those art classes at the community center, the ones that meet in the evenings." They smiled at each other with the comfortable complicity of long-married couples, and I realized they were planning a future that aligned with my schedule, evening activities, night shifts, rather than expecting me to conform to theirs. "Well," I said, "we'll need to get you recovered first. Cardiac rehab before hospital volunteering." "I'll do whatever the doctor orders," my father replied solemnly, but with a hint of humor. "Especially when the doctor is my daughter." Over the next weeks, as my father progressed from hospital patient to outpatient cardiac rehabilitation, our family dynamics continued their subtle transformation. My parents invited me to Sunday dinner as they always had, but now they scheduled it for 6 p.m. to accommodate my night shift schedule rather than the traditional noon gathering. My mother called more frequently, not to question my choices but to share small details of their lives. Updates on my father's recovery, neighborhood news, recipes she thought I might enjoy on my days off. Most significantly, they began visiting the Emma Chen Emergency Center regularly, not as observers this time, but as active participants in its community. My father arranged a gathering of local Chinese-American business leaders to discuss funding for translation services. My mother organized a group of retired teachers to collect books and toys for the pediatric wing waiting area. They brought homemade meals for the night shift staff on holidays, remembering each nurse and tech by name. It was as if, having finally seen and accepted my world, they were determined to become part of it rather than pull me back into theirs. One evening, about 2 months after my father's heart attack, I arrived for my shift to find him sitting at the volunteer's desk in the emergency department lobby, wearing a hospital volunteer jacket and speaking in rapid Mandarin with an elderly woman who clutched a handwritten list of medications. He looked up as I approached, his face lighting with a mix of professional composure and paternal pride. "Dr. Chen," he said formally, then smiled. "My daughter, the emergency director," he explained to the woman in Mandarin. "The best doctor in the hospital." The elderly woman nodded respectfully in my direction, clearly reassured by this connection. "Mrs. Liu is worried about her husband," my father continued, switching to English. "He was admitted an hour ago with symptoms of pneumonia. I've been helping her compile his medication history." I accepted the meticulously organized list he handed me, noting the detailed annotations in my father's precise handwriting. "This is very helpful," I told both of them. "I'll make sure his doctor has this information right away." As I turned to go, my father reached out briefly to touch my arm. "Qiaoji, we're watching Michael's boys tonight so he and Elaine can have dinner out. Your mother's making dumplings. Come by after your shift if you'd like." The casual invitation, the use of my Chinese name, a name I had rarely heard since childhood, the easy way he incorporated my schedule into their plans. All of it represented healing I had once thought impossible. "I'd like that," I said. "Save some for me." He nodded, then turned his attention back to Mrs. Liu, resuming their conversation with the focused care that had once been reserved for business associates and community leaders. I watched for a moment longer, struck by the sight of my father, the man who had once valued status and recognition above all else, wearing a simple volunteer jacket, helping an anxious stranger navigate a frightening system, finding purpose in service rather than accolades. As I walked toward the doctor's lounge to prepare for my shift, I passed the newly completed pediatric wing, its bright murals and child-sized furniture a stark contrast to the institutional feel of the main emergency area. The door to the night staff sanctuary was propped open, revealing several nurses lounging on the comfortable furniture, stealing a moment of rest before the night's cases began arriving. "Dr. Chen," one called out when she saw me, "come see what your father brought us." I stepped into the room, curious. On the central table sat an elaborate multi-tiered carousel of dim sum, steamed dumplings, sesame balls, egg tarts, turnip. Cakes, arranged on bamboo steamers and decorative plates. He said it's for the people who work in darkness, the nurse explained. Said you'd understand. I did understand. The phrase from James's note, the one that had accompanied the list of night shift staff donations, had become something of a motto among our team. I hadn't realized my father had heard it, much less adopted its significance. Did he make all this? I asked, surveying the impressive spread. The nurse nodded. He and your mother, apparently. They spent all day on it. Said it was important. For night shift workers to have proper food, not just vending machine snacks. I thought about the countless nights I'd worked on an empty stomach or subsisted on packaged cookies because there was no time or opportunity for a real meal. About how my parents had once seen my night schedule as evidence of my failure, and now saw it as reason to provide special care. Well, I said, selecting a har-gow dumpling from the top tier. We'd better not let it go to waste. Later that night, between a complicated appendicitis case and a motor vehicle accident victim, I found a moment to text my father. The dim sum was a hit. Thank you. His response came quickly, suggesting he was still awake despite the late hour. Good. Food matters, especially at night. Your grandmother always said that. I smiled, remembering my grandmother's insistence on proper meals at proper times, her belief that food was medicine in its own way. My father had rarely quoted her before, having moved beyond her old country, wisdom in his embrace of American success metrics. Another text arrived. She would have understood your night shifts, I think. She always said the most important work happens when others are sleeping. I stood in the quiet corridor, phone in hand, struck by this new connection to my grandmother, a link my father had never before acknowledged. Perhaps she too had valued types of work my father had dismissed, ways of caring he hadn't recognized, until recently. I wish I could have known that side of her, I replied. You have her spirit, came his response. I just didn't see it until now. I pocketed my phone as my pager beeped, signaling a new arrival in the trauma bay. But I carried my father's words with me as I hurried toward the incoming patient, a sense of lineage restored, of belonging to something older and larger than the divisions that had separated us for so long. My grandmother, the night shift, the work that happens in darkness. My father had finally connected these pieces, had finally seen that my path wasn't a rejection of our family's values, but an expression of its deepest traditions: service, care, presence in moments of crisis. As I pushed through the doors to the trauma bay, my team already assembled and waiting, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't known I was missing. The circle had closed. The prodigal daughter had not returned to the fold. Instead, the family had expanded to include her world, her values, her chosen path. And in that expansion, we had all found something essential that had been lost in the years of rigid expectations and painful estrangement: the ability to see each other clearly, to recognize worth beyond conventional measures, to honor the work each of us was called to do, whether in daylight or darkness. On the 5th anniversary of the Emma Chen Emergency Center's opening, I stood at the podium facing an audience that spanned the spectrum of my life: hospital administrators in formal attire, night shift staff still in scrubs, community members, whose lives had been touched by the center, and, in the front row, my parents. My father, now fully recovered from his heart attack and serving as head of the hospital's volunteer interpreter program, sat straight-backed and attentive. My mother, recently elected to the hospital's patient advocacy board, wore a silk dress, the same shade of blue as the emergency center's logo, a deliberate choice she'd told me that morning. 5 years ago, I began, when we opened these doors, we made a promise to this community that whether you came to us at noon or midnight, you would receive the highest standard of emergency care. Today, I'm proud to share that we've kept that promise. I presented the data that backed this claim: decreased wait times, improved outcomes for cardiac events and strokes, innovative pediatric protocols that had been adopted by hospitals nationwide. The audience nodded at appropriate moments, but these statistics weren't why they had gathered today. But the true measure of our success can't be captured in spreadsheets or research papers, I continued. It lives in the stories of the patients, who have come through our doors during the darkest hours of the night, and in the dedication of the staff who were waiting to receive them. I gestured to the wall behind me, where a digital mosaic had been unveiled. Hundreds of photographs, forming a larger image of the emergency center. Each small photo represented a different night shift team member, patient story, or significant moment from the past 5 years. This installation, which we're dedicating today, is called Visible in Darkness. It honors the work that happens when most of the world is sleeping, work that was once invisible but is now recognized as essential to our mission. My eyes found my father's in the audience. He nodded slightly, understanding the deeper significance of the title, a reference to our family's journey from rejection to recognition, from dismissing night shift work to valuing it. After the ceremony, as guests mingled at the reception, James appeared at my elbow with a champagne flute. "Quite a turnout," he observed, handing me the glass. "The board is impressed." I smiled, taking in the crowded atrium. They should be. The night shift programs have exceeded every benchmark they set. That's not why they're impressed. He nodded toward a cluster of hospital executives deep in conversation with my father. They're impressed because Robert Chen has personally secured donations from half the business leaders in Lakeside. Turns out, your father is quite the fundraiser when he believes in the cause. I watched my father gesture animatedly as he described something to the hospital CEO, probably the new multilingual discharge instruction program he'd been championing for months. The transformation in him still amazed me sometimes. From a man who had valued prestige and visibility above all else, to someone who found purpose in supporting work that happened out of the spotlight. He's good at it, I acknowledged. Better than I ever was. You were too busy doing the actual work, James replied. Some people are builders, some are ambassadors. You needed both. My mother approached, looking flushed with excitement. Emma, come quickly. There's someone you need to meet. She led me through the crowd to a young woman in medical school whites, probably a third-year student based on the visible exhaustion and determination in her stance. This is Minji Park, my mother said. She specifically requested to rotate through night shifts in our emergency department. Tell Emma why, she prompted the student. Minji straightened, clearly nervous to be addressing the director of emergency services. Dr. Chen, I read your paper on circadian-optimized trauma protocols when I was an undergraduate. It's why I decided to specialize in emergency medicine. I was touched but a bit confused by my mother's excitement over this interaction. We often had students inspired by research publications. But there's more, my mother insisted, practically glowing with pride. Tell her the rest. Minji smiled shyly. My parents were not supportive of my medical career. They wanted me to go into business like my brothers. When I chose emergency medicine, they stopped paying for my education. She glanced at my mother. Mrs. Chen told me about your experience, about how your parents initially rejected your choice to work night shifts. I shot a surprised look at my mother, who had never before mentioned our family's painful history to outsiders. Your mother has been helping me navigate the scholarship office, Minji continued, and she and Mr. Chen have established a fund for students specifically interested in night shift emergency medicine. This was completely new information. You've established a scholarship fund? I asked my mother. She lifted her chin with a touch of her old pride. The Night Shift Excellence Scholarship, for students who show particular promise in emergency medicine, especially those interested in working during non-traditional hours. She touched Minji's arm gently. Students whose families may not understand their calling. I was speechless. My parents had not only accepted my career path, they had created a way to support others following similar journeys. It's a small fund still growing, my mother added, misinterpreting my silence as disappointment. But we've secured pledges from several of your father's business associates. It's not small, I finally managed to say. It's extraordinary. Minji nodded enthusiastically. It's made all the difference for me, and knowing there are others who faced similar resistance. She looked at me with admiration that made me slightly uncomfortable. It helps to know it's possible to succeed despite family opposition, or to succeed with family support. That comes later than it should have, my mother amended quietly. She squeezed Minji's hand. Now go find Robert, my husband. He wanted to introduce you to the dean of students. As Minji walked away, I turned to my mother. You never told me about this scholarship. We wanted it to be established first, she explained, to make sure it was sustainable before we announced it. But why? I asked. After everything you and Dad believed about night shifts, about visible success. She looked at me steadily, her eyes clear and certain in a way they hadn't been during my childhood, when her gaze had always held a hint of anxiety about status and appearances. Because we were wrong, Emma, and being wrong cost us years with our daughter. Her voice was firm, without self-pity. If we can prevent other families from making the same mistake, that's a worthy use of our resources. I was saved from having to formulate a response, my eyes dangerously close to tearing up, by the approach of Dr. Diana Reynolds, now the hospital's chief executive officer. Emma, Linda, she greeted us warmly. Congratulations on the anniversary. The emergency center has become the crown jewel of our hospital system. My mother beamed with unmistakable pride. Emma has built something remarkable. Indeed, she has, Diana agreed, which is why I'd like to discuss an expansion of her role. I raised an eyebrow questioningly. The board is creating a new position, Chief of Emergency Services for the entire regional system, overseeing all 7 emergency departments, standardizing protocols, implementing your night shift innovations. System-wide. She smiled. We'd like you to consider taking it on. It was a significant promotion, exactly the kind of high-profile, prestigious role my parents would have once desperately wanted for me. I glanced at my mother, curious about her reaction. Would she still maintain clinical duties? My mother asked, surprising me with the question. Diana hesitated. It would primarily be administrative, perhaps 1 shift per week to stay current. 1 night shift? My mother pressed. Diana looked between us, clearly sensing some undercurrent she didn't fully understand. That would be up to Emma, of course. My mother nodded, satisfied with this answer. She squeezed my arm once, then excused herself to join my father across the room, leaving me alone with Diana. Your mother seems concerned about your clinical time, Diana observed. Most parents would be thrilled about an executive promotion. I watched my mother thread her way through the crowd, stopping to greet night shift nurses by name, asking about their families with genuine interest. She understands now that my best work happens at the bedside, not behind a desk, I said. She's protecting what matters to me. Diana considered this. The role can be shaped to your priorities, Emma. We need your leadership, but we also value your clinical expertise. I promised to consider the offer, then moved through the reception, greeting colleagues and community members, accepting congratulations on the anniversary. But my mind kept returning to my mother's question. Would I still work night shifts? And what it revealed about how thoroughly she had come to understand and respect my calling. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the night shift had taken over the emergency center, I found myself walking through the quiet corridors of the pediatric wing. The space had evolved over the past 5 years from a construction zone to a fully realized environment designed specifically for children and families in crisis. Murals of starry night skies covered the walls, Child-sized furniture filled the waiting areas, and each exam room contained comfort items donated by community groups, stuffed animals, books, hand-knitted blankets. I paused at the entrance to the Night Staff Sanctuary, now a well-used retreat where team members caught moments of rest between cases. The bookshelves James had installed were filled now. Medical references, yes, but also novels, poetry collections, and photography books, contributed by staff members over the years. A bulletin board displayed thank you cards from patients, photos of team celebrations, and a prominently featured definition: night shift, N. The people who work in darkness so others can sleep in peace. I thought I might find you here, my father's voice came from behind me. I turned to see him standing in the corridor, jacket draped over his arm, looking tired but content after the day's events. Just checking in before I head home, I explained. Old habits. He nodded, understanding. Your mother's waiting in the car. We wanted to say goodnight before we left. I followed him toward the main entrance, both of us quiet as we passed through the department that bore my name. At this hour, the emergency center had settled into its night rhythm, the controlled urgency of staff prepared for whatever might come through the doors, the hushed conversations at the nurses' station, the steady beeping of monitors from occupied rooms. Diana Reynolds mentioned the new position to me, my father said as we walked. Chief of Emergency Services. I glanced at him, trying to read his thoughts. It's a significant opportunity. It is, he agreed. Very prestigious. 5 years ago, no, even 2 years ago, he would have pushed me to accept immediately, would have seen it as validation of my worth, proof that I had finally achieved the kind of visible success he valued. I waited for that reaction now, steeling myself against disappointment. Instead, he stopped walking and turned to face me directly. What do you want, Emma? Not what looks best on paper, not what advances your career fastest. What work makes you feel most yourself? The question, so simple, so profound, and so unexpected from the father who had once planned my life according to his own metrics of success, left me momentarily speechless. I want to keep treating patients, I said finally, especially at night, when they're most vulnerable and have fewest options. The administrative work matters, but it's not why I became a doctor. He nodded, accepting this without argument. Then you should negotiate a role that allows for both. Leadership is important, but not at the expense of the work that gives you purpose. We resumed walking, reaching the main entrance where my mother waited by the sliding glass doors. She smiled as we approached, her expression softening as it always did now when she saw me in my professional environment. Diana told me about the new position, she said, echoing my father's opening. Chief of Emergency Services. I nodded, waiting for her response. I told her you would need to maintain your night shifts, she continued. That your research on circadian-optimized emergency care depends on your direct clinical experience. I blinked in surprise. My mother, who had once lamented that my night schedule kept me from attending the right social events, from meeting the right people, was now advocating for me to continue working when most of the world slept. It does, I agreed. But the title would certainly please the extended family. It was a mild reference to the aunts and uncles and cousins who had sided with my parents during the years of estrangement, who had viewed my career choices with the same disappointment and confusion. Many of them had eventually come around, especially after the emergency center naming. But some still regarded my work schedule as odd, unfortunate, or unnecessarily difficult. The extended family can adapt, as we have, my father said firmly. Your cousin Wei still asks when you're going to open a normal practice, but he'll understand eventually. Or he won't, my mother added with a shrug that would have been unthinkable in her former status-conscious self. Either way, you have built something meaningful here, Emma, something that matters more than appearances. As they prepared to leave, my mother reached up to straighten my lab coat collar. a maternal gesture from my childhood that now felt like both memory and new connection. "We're proud of you," she said simply. "Not because your name is on the building or because you've been offered an executive title, but because every night you choose to be exactly where you're needed most." After they left, I didn't immediately return to my office or head home. Instead, I made my way to the emergency center's main trauma bay, the heart of the department where the most critical cases were treated. At this hour, it stood empty, prepared for whatever the night might bring. I ran my hand along the edge of the gurney, remembering the countless patients who had arrived here in crisis, the car accident victims, the heart attacks, the complicated deliveries, the overdoses. Remembering, too, my parents on separate gurneys, the night of the restaurant fire, when I had treated them without them knowing who was behind the mask and gloves. My pager beeped, a notification rather than an emergency. A text from James. "Heard about the chief position. What are you thinking?" I typed back, "Thinking I want to keep doing the work that matters, not just talk about it from an office." His response came quickly. "No reason you can't do both. Write it into the contract. The night shift still needs its champion at the leadership table." Champion, the word resonated. 5 years ago, I had been a solitary voice advocating for night shift resources, protocols, and recognition. Now the night shift had many champions, including, most surprisingly, my parents. My pager beeped again, this time with an actual code. "Multiple trauma patients incoming from a highway accident. ETA 15 minutes. I headed for the staff locker room to change back into scrubs, my decision about the new position temporarily set aside in favor of the immediate work at hand. The trauma team assembled rapidly. Nurses, techs, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, all moving with the coordinated precision that came from years of working together through countless night emergencies. As we prepared the trauma bay, I caught sight of the digital mosaic unveiled earlier that day, visible in darkness, now illuminated against the wall of the main corridor. From this distance, the hundreds of individual photographs merged to form a larger image, hands reaching toward each other across a dark space, fingers almost touching in a deliberate echo of Michelangelo's creation of Adam. Up close, one could see that the hands were those of emergency providers and patients, captured in moments of connection, care, and healing. I had commissioned the artwork months ago, working with a local photographer to collect images from night shifts across the emergency center's 5-year history. But seeing it now, as we prepared to receive patients in critical need, the symbolism struck me anew. The reaching across darkness, the connection forged in crisis, the healing that happens when someone is present at the worst moments of another's life. My father, in his volunteer jacket, appeared at the entrance to the trauma bay. 4 patients incoming, he reported crisply. 2 critical, 2 serious. First ambulance 3 minutes out. Family members following in private vehicles, likely to need interpreter services. I nodded my thanks, noting how seamlessly he had integrated himself into the emergency workflow, how naturally he had found his place in this world he had once rejected. "I'll handle the families," he continued. "Keep them updated, help with paperwork, whatever's needed." "Thank you," I said, already focusing on the trauma preparations. "We'll need that support." He lingered a moment longer. "Emma," he said quietly, "this is where you belong. Remember that when you're considering Diana's offer." Then he was gone, moving toward the family waiting area to prepare for the arrival of frightened loved ones who would need his calm presence and clear communication in the hours ahead. The first ambulance arrived, and we shifted into the controlled urgency of trauma care. Each team member focused on their specific role, each action guided by protocols refined through years of night shift experience. As I directed the team, my father's words echoed in my mind. "This is where you belong." Not in an executive office, not at administrative meetings. not in the visible positions of prestige he had once insisted were the only measure of success. But here, in the controlled chaos of emergency medicine, in the darkness of night shifts, in the moments when patients were most vulnerable and most in need of the skills I had spent a decade honing, hours later, when all 4 accident victims had been stabilized and transferred to appropriate units, I found my father still in the family waiting area. He sat with an elderly couple, grandparents of one of the patients, speaking to them in Mandarin, his hand occasionally patting the woman's arm in reassurance. When he saw me approach, he said something to them and stood to meet me. "Their grandson is stable," I told him. "Broken femur, some internal bruising, but no life-threatening injuries. He's being prepared for surgery now." My father nodded and relayed this information to the couple, whose faces relaxed visibly with relief. He added something that made the woman reach out and grasp my hand, speaking rapidly in dialect, too regional for me to fully follow. "She says heaven sent you to care for their only grandson," my father translated. "She says only the most dedicated. Doctors work when others sleep, and they are grateful you chose this path." I smiled at the woman and squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Tell her it was my privilege to help, and that her grandson is in excellent hands with our surgical team." After the couple had gone to the surgical waiting area, my father turned to me. He looked tired but fulfilled. The lines of his face settled into an expression of quiet satisfaction that I had rarely seen during my childhood. "You should go home," I told him. "It's nearly 3 a.m. Mom will be worried." He shook his head. "She knows where I am. This is important work, being with families during their worst moments." He studied my face. "You taught me that." The simple acknowledgement that I had taught him something valuable, something that had changed his understanding of what mattered, still surprised me, even after years of reconciliation and rebuilt trust. "I never thought I'd see you volunteering in an emergency room at 3 in the morning, I admitted. "Especially not in this emergency room." "Neither did I," he agreed with a slight smile. "But I've discovered something interesting about night shifts, Emma. There's a clarity that comes in these hours, a stripping away of pretense and performance. People are more genuine in crisis and in darkness, more their true selves." It was an insight I had long understood, but had never expected to hear from my father. The man who had once valued appearance above authenticity, reputation above reality. "That's why you belong here," he continued. "Not because your name is on the building or because you've proven us wrong about night shifts, but because this work reveals your true character, and it is extraordinary." Before I could respond to this unexpected praise, my pager sounded again. Another incoming case, this one a cardiac emergency. I gave my father a quick, apologetic nod and hurried back to the trauma bay, falling easily into the rhythm of emergency care that had become the heartbeat of my professional life. As dawn approached and my shift neared its end, I found a quiet moment to slip away to my office. On my desk lay the formal offer letter for the Chief of Emergency Services position, delivered by courier during yesterday's anniversary celebration. I sat down and reread the details, considering my father's words, my mother's advocacy for my continued clinical work, and James's suggestion to reshape the role to include both administrative leadership and hands-on emergency care. I took out a pen and began drafting my response. Not an acceptance or rejection, but a counterproposal. I would take on the system-wide leadership role, would champion emergency services across all 7 hospitals, would implement the night shift protocols that had proven so successful. But I would maintain my clinical practice, including at least 2 night shifts per week in the emergency center that bore my name. Because my father was right. This was where I belonged. In the intersection of darkness and healing, in the moments when patients needed not just medical expertise but human presence, in the quiet hours when the most essential work happened without spotlight or audience. As I finished the letter, my phone chimed with a text message from my mother. "Coming to breakfast after your shift? Made your favorite congee." I smiled at this simple evidence of how much had changed. My mother not only accepting my night schedule, but adapting family routines to accommodate it, creating new traditions to replace those that had been lost during our years of estrangement. I texted back, "Yes, be there by 8. Then I sealed the letter, placed it in my outbox, and prepared to finish my shift. One night's work complete, with countless others still ahead in the career I had chosen and the life I had built, now finally visible to those whose recognition I had once craved beyond all else. Outside my office window, the sky was beginning to lighten with approaching dawn. Another night shift ending, another day beginning. The cycle continuing, as it always would, with or without witnesses to its quiet magic. But now, at last, my work in darkness had been seen, not just by hospital administrators or medical colleagues, not just by patients grateful for care in their moments of crisis, but by the two people whose blindness to its value had once caused me the deepest pain. My parents had finally looked past the conventional markers of success they had once insisted upon, had seen the worth in work done without audience or accolades, had recognized that their daughter had always been exactly where she needed to be, not in spite of the darkness, but because of what that darkness revealed about the true nature of healing, of service, of presence when it matters most. The morning I accepted the position of Chief of Emergency Services for the entire Lakeside health system, I found a small package on my desk. No card, no note, just a simple box wrapped in cream-colored paper. Inside was a vintage pager, clearly from the early 2000s, mounted in a shadow box with an engraved plate that read, "For those who answer the call when others sleep." I immediately recognized it as my first pager from residency, the one I'd kept for sentimental reasons, but had lost track of years ago. Only one person could have saved it all this time. That evening, after signing the contract that officially expanded my role while preserving my night shift clinical hours, I drove to my parents' house for our weekly dinner. My mother opened the door before I could knock, embracing me with a warmth that still felt new after so many years of coldness. "Congratulations, Chief," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "Your father's been telling everyone who'll listen." In the kitchen, my father stood at the stove, stirring a pot of his famous beef noodle soup, a dish he'd rarely prepared during my childhood, but now made regularly for family gatherings. "The pager," I said by way of greeting. "You kept it all this time?" He turned, wooden spoon in hand, and smiled. "I found it in your old room after you moved out. I was going to return it, but then—" He shrugged, the gesture containing all the years of estrangement neither of us liked to directly reference. "Why keep it?" I asked. "Because it was yours," he said simply. "Because even when I didn't understand your choices, I knew they mattered to you." My mother set the table as we talked, laying out the special porcelain dishes reserved for celebrations. My brother Michael and his family would arrive soon, along with James, who had become a regular at these family dinners. "The new position," my father continued, tasting the broth and adding a pinch more salt. "You made sure to keep your clinical shifts?" 2 nights per week in the emergency center, plus 1 shift monthly at each of the other hospitals in the system, I confirmed. "The administrative work is important, but I need to stay connected to the actual medicine." He nodded approvingly. "Leadership from experience, not just theory. That's why they chose you." Once, such a comment would have been loaded with subtext. Reminder that prestigious titles and visible positions were the only true measures of success in his eyes. Now it was simply an acknowledgement of my professional path, a path he had come to respect on its own terms. My mother joined us, setting a small dish of sliced scallions on the counter. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. "She always said true healers work by moonlight as well as sunlight." I raised an eyebrow. "You never told me Grandma said that." "Because I disagreed with her," my mother admitted. "I thought success had to look a certain way, had to be seen by the right people." She sprinkled the scallions into the soup my father was stirring. I was trying to protect you from what I saw as a harder path. I didn't realize you were strong enough to forge your own. The doorbell rang. Michael and his family arriving. Their 2 boys rushed in, now teenagers with their own emerging personalities and interests. The older one, Nathan, immediately launched into an excited description of his science project on circadian rhythms. "Aunt Emma, I cited your paper on night shift protocols," he exclaimed. "My teacher was super impressed. She wants to know if you'd come speak to our class." My father beamed at this evidence that his grandson was following in my academic footsteps rather than only his father's more conventional path. Michael, instead of showing any jealousy that his son looked up to his sister, nodded encouragingly. "You should do it," he said. "The next generation needs to understand there are many valid ways to use a medical degree." The ease of this statement, from my brother who had once been held up as the model of proper career choices, marked how far our family had evolved. No more narrow definitions of success, no more rigid expectations about whose path was worthy of respect. James arrived last, bringing a bottle of wine and news from the hospital board. "They've unanimously approved the expansion of night shift staffing at all 7 emergency departments," he announced. "Your protocols will be implemented system-wide by the end of the year." As we gathered around the table, my father raised his glass. "To Emma," he said, "who taught us all to see value in work done in darkness." The toast was simple, but it contained the entirety of our family's journey, from rejection to recognition, from narrow definitions of success to a broader understanding of purpose and meaning. Later, as dinner wound down and conversations splintered into smaller groups, my mother pulled me aside. "There's something we've been meaning to show you," she said, leading me to what had once been my father's home office. The space had been transformed. Where once there had been diplomas and business awards, the walls now displayed framed letters, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. "These are from patients and families who received care in the emergency center's night shift," my mother explained. "Your father has been collecting them since he started volunteering. People write to thank the hospital, and he requests copies of any that mention night staff." I moved closer to examine the letters. Some were handwritten on personal stationery, others typed on formal letterhead. All expressed gratitude for care received during night hours, for staff who had been present and compassionate during their darkest moments. "Why keep them here?" I asked, gesturing to the prime real estate of what had once been my father's most private domain. "Because this is where he works now," my mother said. "He reviews volunteer applications in here, coordinates the interpreter schedule, writes grant proposals for the scholarship fund. He says these letters remind him why the work matters." I touched one of the frames, a letter from a mother whose child had been treated for a severe asthma attack at 3 a.m. She had specifically mentioned the night shift doctor who had sat with her son and taught him breathing techniques after the acute attack had been controlled. "I didn't write this one," I said, recognizing the scenario but not the specific case. "No," my mother agreed. "This was Dr. Patel, one of the physicians you trained. Your father keeps these to remind himself that the work continues, that what you built extends beyond your personal impact." I was moved beyond words, not just by the collection of gratitude, but by what it represented. My father, who had once measured success by bonuses and business awards, now surrounded himself with evidence of healing that happened in darkness, of lives touched by the very work he had once dismissed. "He's proud of you, Emma," my mother said softly. "We both are. Not because you've earned an impressive title or because important people know your name, but because you stayed true to your calling, even when we couldn't see its value." She squeezed my hand. "You were right all along. The most important work does happen when no one is watching. Thank you for showing us that." As I rejoined the gathering in the dining room, where my father was now entertaining his grandsons with stories from his volunteer shifts, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with professional achievements or official recognition. The journey that had begun with rejection and estrangement had come full circle, not to a restoration of what was, but to the creation of something new and stronger. My parents had not simply reconciled with my choices, they had embraced them, championed them, extended them to others walking similar paths, and I had found what I had been seeking all along, not their approval, but their understanding. Not their permission, but their recognition that my work in darkness mattered precisely because it happened beyond the spotlight, in the moments when patients were most vulnerable and most in need of a steady presence. As James raised his glass, in a final toast, to the Chen family, who taught me that it's never too late to see clearly what was in front of you all along, I looked around the table at these people who had traveled such a complicated road together. My father, who had learned that true value isn't always visible to casual observers. My mother, who had discovered that success comes in many forms, not all of them easily displayed or discussed at social gatherings. My brother, who had found the courage to let his sons choose their own paths, rather than following prescribed routes to achievement. And me, the night shift doctor who had once been rejected for working in darkness, but now had her name on the building where that essential work continued night after night, whether anyone was watching or not. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.